Looking at human beings as one species is not biologically valid. We are a variety of subspecies, politically, ethnically, sometimes, definitely in terms of gender, in terms of IQ, in terms of culture. These produce physical brain differences that are very hard to remediate when you get older. And so we are a cluster of genetics all fighting to reproduce their own particular genetics. And all of this requires that the IQ can be raised. The IQ of a lot of these countries is 85. That is a full standard deviation below the IQ of Europe. A full standard deviation below the IQ of Europe. Now, if there's any genetic component to that, and I believe that there is, nobody knows for sure, it's just a belief, but it's a belief with quite a bit of data, and we're just about to put out an interview with Dr. Jason Richwine about this. But if there's any genetic components, or if the culture is so insular that it's equivalent to genetic in the transmission of low intelligence, then you cannot run a high IQ society with low IQ people. Now, if there are genetic components to the low IQ of the people coming in, I will tell you exactly what's going to happen. And it's really obvious. And this, if it is genetic or equivalent to genetic, they're low IQ, I can tell you exactly what's going to happen. They're going to fail. These immigrants are going to fail. And they're not just going to fail a little bit, they're going to fail hard. You are importing a radicalized low IQ population into a high IQ society, and capitalism pays for intelligence. That's what it does. You get paid for your intelligence. And so you are importing a huge bunch of people into Europe who are going to fail. They're not staying on welfare because they're lazy. They're not. That's like saying somebody with an IQ of 80 doesn't apply to graduate school because they're lazy. No. They're doing what is economically the best option for them. Again, in general, right? But you are importing a gene set that is incompatible with success in a free market economy. Now, because no one can talk about IQ and no one can talk about any potential genetic relationship between ethnic communities and IQ, what that means is that the only way that anyone will ever explain the failures of these Africans in a European society, you know as well as I do, how is everyone going to explain that?
They're going to say that it's oppressive white culture of Europe, that
white racism. When you have a largely homogenous society, right? Let's say Haiti, right? Haiti's a lot of blacks and so on, right? And so if there's a big change to be made in society, let's say Haiti runs out of money, or as you said, right? New Zealand ran out of money until the giant Hobbit resurgent economy hit them with the Peter Jackson money bombs. But if you have a largely ethnically homogenous society, that when the shit hits the wall and people have got to change, there's not really that much infighting. There is a sense of, okay, we're all going to pull together. We all have kind of the same color eyes, and there's no point turning on each other because we kind of all got in this together, so we all have to pull together to get out of it together, right? So when you have an ethnically homogenous society, when the shit hits the wall, you don't dissolve into massive race-baiting wars, which is, a problem that happens because skills and abilities have not been distributed evenly by Mother Nature between various ethnicities. And what that means is that when the shit hits the wall, it hits some ethnicities a lot harder than others, and then you get endless screams of racism. And this is one fundamental reason why America's having trouble solving these problems, is that everybody knows that if you cut spending, which community is it going to hit the hardest? Hint, it's not Korean, right? So if you cut social spending in America, it's going to hit the black community the hardest. This is another reason why this multi-ethnic societies is a problem. It wouldn't be as much of a problem if the ethnicities all act the same, roughly, then it's not really a big problem. People say, oh, well, the Germans came over and the Irish came over. Yeah, and, they kind of ended up acting pretty much the same after a certain amount of time, a generation or two. But the problem is among the blacks and the Hispanics, they don't end up acting the same as the white population or the Asian population. And the white population doesn't even act as well as the Asian population in terms of murder rates and income and unemployment and so on, and single motherhood and family stability and so on. So we all need to turn Japanese. That's my first point. But my second point is that when the shit hits the wall and the government starts running out of money, well, it doesn't end up affecting ethnicities in the same way. And because you've got the racist in chief currently manning the helm, and the media, of course, compliant and willing to scream racist at anyone who points out basic fact-based differences between ethnicities, you've got a problem. You can't deal with the situation until Obama's out, or until people understand that ethnicities in America and all around the world tend to act differently collectively. I mean, individuals are always different, but collectively, ethnicities around the world tend to act differently. They tend to have different incomes. They tend to have different rates of marital stability. They tend to have different rates of criminality. They tend to have different rates of different accumulations of assets. They tend to have different levels of education. You go on and on and on until people accept that and say, okay, well, if we cut spending, government spending, it's going to affect the black community the worst. It's going to affect the Hispanic community the second worst. It's going to affect the white community the third worst. And I think Asians will heave up a giant sigh of relief that they're not being taxed with a giant plumbing suction hole through the butt. So until these facts are either dealt with or until people give up race baiting, I'm not sure which one I consider to be more likely. Trying to deal with these problems is a real challenge. And because you have a race baiter in chief in charge of the White House, the Republicans, I think, are very loath to start cutting spending because it's going to hit the black community, and they've got this giant klaxon of racism in the White House who's going to amplify it through the mainstream media to the point where society will probably hit a revolution. And this is something that, again, is well known within the professional literature and professional periodicals and so on, which is simply not making it out for a variety of reasons we could discuss, that there is a hierarchy that is currently recognized. And I think you gathered together a list of 50 or so experts who repeated all of this stuff ad infinitum, still, again, not making it into general culture as a whole, which is that there is, you could roughly equate a sort of 5-part split or divergence among IQs for particular groups with, I think, as Charles Murray pointed out, Ashkenazi Jews sort of at the top, 110, 115, and if you just focus on verbal, 120 plus.
Yeah, these are the averages where the middle pack falls.
Right. And then I've heard a variety for Asians, 103, 106, and so on, but very strong in visual spatial. The sort of myth of the stereotype of the Asian engineer versus the Jewish engineer. Ashkenazi Jews actually score a little bit below. Yeah, they score a little bit below the norm in visual spatial, but of course, in terms of language skills, they're through the roof, which is why you see a lot of writers and directors and so on. And so you've got Ashkenazi Jews, and then you have Asians, and then you have whites who are normed, Caucasians normed around 100. And then, if I remember the numbers rightly, sort of low 90s for Hispanics, and then 85, which is a full standard deviation below whites for blacks. And these differences have persisted for I think as long as the tests have been going on. And the more G-loaded the tests are, the more they're trying to measure general intelligence, which is directly associated with physical structures in the brain we can get into. The more G-loaded the tests are, the more they tend to reaffirm this sort of 5-point spread. And so when you look at society without seeing these differences in ethnicities and IQ, it really becomes hard to understand how society is and why it looks the way it looks without this. So because I think a lot of people are still quite startled to hear that information, I just wanted to give that background, and of course correct me anywhere I may have gone astray.
No, I would just add one more group, and that's African blacks. The IQs of different groups of African blacks, range more around 70. So I would add those as well. So there's a huge difference in let's say branches of the family tree as they've developed to this time.
And I tell you, I mean, Linda, it's I have this emotional resistance to the genetics, and I'm sure I'm speaking for a lot, you know, like, because I feel it's like
let me give you something that will help. But go
okay.
ahead.
Well, it's sort of, I feel like a stick insect trying to climb a waterfall. You know, I'm sure I can do it, but then this data just keeps coming down and knocking me away and putting me back down into the pool, because we all like to think that it's a solvable problem, and the degree to which
The problem in what?
The disparate intelligences, in average intelligences between ethnicities, because we've got this multicultural society, and if we have in general again, we're speaking statistically overall. I have to put these caveats into every show. You know, this is all big picture stuff. You know, 15 to 20% of blacks are smarter than the average whites. And, you know, I've been heavily influenced by some very heavy hitting black intellectuals, Tom Sowell and Shelby Steele and Walter Williams and so on. So this is all big picture stuff. But if overall there's kind of a doomed underclass or two and a bunch of overlords, so to speak, in a free society, so I feel this resistance to it. But as the evidence, and I've had Dr. Flynn on and other Dr. Turkheimer on and so on, other people who are more environmentarians or whatever you'd want to call them, and I just feel that the evidence can't be resisted. And again, until we have incontrovertible genome disparities and it becomes, you know, at some point, if it's valid that it's genetics, it's going to be irresistible. But when I hear things like, you know, blacks adopted into white families end up with the same intelligence range as those who weren't, and people say, oh, well, it's expectations. Everyone expects the blacks aren't going to do as well. And then you find out that there are black kids who were so pale that everyone thought they were white, even though they're largely black genetically, and they still end up with the same IQ. And when you find out that blacks from the highest 20% of socioeconomic status still underperform whites from the bottom 20% of socioeconomic status, and when you find out that genetic proximity and intelligence is dose dependent, that your siblings are more like you and then your cousins a little bit less, and it fades away to the 17-point IQ difference with strangers, although you've got 12 between siblings, it seems like it's one of these just straw that breaks the camel's back, because none of these things are final, but together they accumulate, to me at least, to portray a worldview that is emotionally difficult, which, you know, is just something to admit. It's not obviously something you can guide your conclusions by. But I really am having a tough time getting up that waterfall of the environmental side. So either they're going to bring their wives, in which case they're going to start breeding, or and this is true of third world cultures as a whole. Low IQ cultures, you know, you could argue that there are selected, as we've talked about in Gene Wars. They just have kids and 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 have kids. And that's the nature of the beast. This is one of the reasons why the countries remain poor. I mean, other than the IQ, it's a signal they just breed like crazy. No resources, not enough to go around. So either they bring their wives or they don't bring their wives, in which case you have a lot of unattached young men with no jobs, no family prospects, no dating prospects. What happens then?
It's definitely a recipe for disaster.
Oh, absolutely. It is. And this is what I've been saying. You know, we started doing IQ years ago. And it's hard for people to grasp. It's hard for people to grasp. You know, human biodiversity is a challenging topic. It's challenging on the left because everybody's supposed to be shaped by economic forces and everyone's supposed to be this clay that you can mold into whatever you want. So the left doesn't like the fact that there seem to be hard limits to abilities between ethnic groups. And the right doesn't like it because they tend to be more religious and everyone's made in the image of God. So both the left and the right reject the human biodiversity that comes from 50 to 60 to 70,000 years in wildly disparate environments, which is exactly the kind of evolution that you would expect. So you have this weird unity between the left and the right to reject human biodiversity, differences in strengths and weaknesses, abilities and limitations between races or ethnicities. It's one of these weird ways in which both the left and the right completely agree for vastly different reasons. as you know, in a lot of states, Asians, East Asians, tend to have their scores reduced on the SAT, and whites, I think, are fairly neutral. Hispanics and blacks have their scores increased. And the degree to which there are cultural differences that could be changed to more of a focus on education, more of a focus on reading and so on in Black and Hispanic communities could really help, I believe. And of course, I've long talked about excessive corporal punishment in Black and Hispanic communities and so on. So there's cultural things that are cultural things, what a terrible things based on culture. There's sort of cultural habits that are sort of covered up by all of this stuff. So you keep the unemployment numbers low, indoctrinate the kids, and cover up certain cultural deficiencies when it comes to approaches to education. And I think all of those things combine to create this kind of whirlwind or giant sucking sound or whirlpool of lowering standards. And man, when you lower the standards in culture, it no longer remains culture. You are no longer cultured.
It's not just that you're lowering the standards, because we are doing that. And so we're starting to see a fallback. This was by design. Rather than try to elevate the cultures, the individuals, and all of us who are at the lower end of the spectrum, rather than try to elevate us now, the mantra is that we are, those of us who are behind, whether for cultural or personal reasons, those of us who are behind because somebody else is doing it to us. We have completely exonerated on this is where all the social justice comes in. This is where all the identity politics, all the Black Lives Matter stuff, all the Marxist stuff. The argument now is that if you are underperforming, it's not because you're not working hard enough. It's the I'm as good as you that Lewis was talking about. That I'm as good as you. If I'm not doing as well as you, it must be because you're tyrannizing me. It must be because your culture is holding me down. And so not only are we are lowering standards, but we're also telling the people at the bottom of the standard that they're there because of the greed, the racism, the bigotry of other people. So now we have low achieving kids who are not achieving, and we're not helping them. We have no way to help them. But what we're doing is we're keeping them ignorant, but we're feeding them all this social justice theory. So these kids who are underperforming now have no impetus to work harder. Even to suggest a child who's failing work harder is a microaggression, right? If that kid happens to be non-white and non-male. So you can't even suggest, you can't even point out to these struggling students there's a problem. And you take away that and you fill their heads with whatever you have that I don't is a result of your having taken it from my people. And so that's what we're seeing on campus now. Greater and greater ignorance and more political arrogance. Though that's a dangerous combination for any culture.
And I think about this. Because this bothers me at my very, very core, because I think like every decent person in society, I'd love to see more egalitarianism of outcome among disparate ethnic and racial groups. I think that would be just what a great thing that would be in society. But I think that by, of course, talking to minority kids and saying you have little chance because of institutional racism, which is a wonderful thing. It's like this voodoo spell that conjures racism even when there's no evidence of racism, because you can just replace the word personal racism with individual racism. You don't have to prove anything. But not only is it not trying to work hard to instill better work ethics and better focus and so on, and this should start, way back in the day, of course. You can't just do it immediately to people who've come to college. But also, isn't it fair to say, Dr. Pastor, that it's teaching people to hate the dominant culture? And if I go to Japan and I want to succeed in Japan and I hate everything about Japan and I say it's really prejudiced against white people and Japanese people are racist, there's this institutionalized racism, they're always rejecting me, they're always blackballing me, they're always ostracizing me, I can't get ahead and it's because they're so nasty and they're so evil, what possible chance do I have to succeed in a Japanese society? Isn't it crippling people of their chance to succeed by not only refusing to confront them on potentially poor work or study habits, but also filling them full of hatred of the entire culture or system that they're going to need to work in to succeed?
As you say, once you open the door, where does it end? Once you determine that perhaps the races are not equivalent, oh my gosh, where does this lead? But to that argument, I point out that we are now building a society based on a complete misperception about race, which leads to all kinds of absurd distortions, inequalities, and all manner of unfairness in the other direction, I think is increasingly intolerable. way we find North Asians living in terms of illegitimacy rates, per capita income, crime rates. In all of those respects, they build societies that are frankly objectively superior to those of whites, which does not necessarily mean that we wish to turn Japanese or be replaced by Japanese or Koreans. But along those standards, they are different and they can be described as superior to us.
We did a presentation last fall called The Truth About Crime, and we sort of pointed out that crime is not evenly distributed among ethnicities, and also there are other potentially genetic constituencies of those ethnicities that are also not evenly distributed, such as an IQ, and we talk about the warrior gene and so on. So there is, of course, the internal ambitions, but, as we've seen from people in the past, people like Richard Lynn or, of course, Charles Murray, Jason Richwine, and so on, people who have decided to bubble up some of the human biodiversity challenges that society might be facing. There is a significant backlash, in particular from the media, who are generally populated by people on the left and who are environmental determinists, so to speak. So I think there's that aspect as well that is keeping this conversation away from the general public at a time when I think it's more desperately needed than ever.
Sure. I wouldn't disagree at all.
If you look around the world, cross-national differences in the rate of violent crime, murder, rape, and serious assault, significantly correlated to a country's IQ scores. So the higher the IQ of a country in general, the lower the rate of crime. High IQ is a very precious resource in society. High IQ people tend to be more mentally healthy, more sociable. They tend to have longer lasting and more stable marriages. They tend to be better parents. They tend to just be more richer, of course. They generally tend to do better in society. So this is a significant value in society. And we had Jason Richwine on the show who was talking about the study that he did at Harvard, where he was pointing out that Hispanics come in with significantly lower IQs than Asians, Ashkenazi Jews, or whites, and that this lower IQ persists over several generations, which would seem to indicate that there's a strong genetic component. Genetics often considered to be between sort of 50 to 60 to 80% of one's final IQ. Say to the black families, look, when you abuse your children, you are setting events in motion that if they have this genetic susceptibility, and if you look at these ratios, it's huge, you are setting events in motion that are going to result in increased criminality in your population. You already have higher testosterone, according to many measures. If you have this genetic susceptibility to being triggered by violence, into becoming violent, being triggered by violence into becoming a violent person, maltreat an Asian child, I don't know, what do you get, a great pianist? I don't know. Maltreat a Caucasian kid, I don't know, you get some goth, but maltreat a black kid. And the prevalence of this warrior gene sequence, particularly this 2 repeat, you're going to get a very different kind of person. Self-reported spanking prevalence by race. Asians, 73% of Asian families say they spank their kids. Whites, 79%. Hispanics, 80%. Blacks, 89%. Listen, for anyone who thinks that this is driven by a negative view of the black population, this information has been systematically suppressed and hidden. This is all sourced below. You can find all the data below. I don't think that you can find many people out there who care more about the black community than people who are willing to talk about actual facts that help the black community escape this cycle of poverty and violence. So the idea that this is somehow racist or negative towards the black community, the people who are truly racist and horrible towards the black community are the people who keep this information away that could actually help the black community become far better than it is now. Those are the people who are doing the significant harm to the black community, not people who are reaching out with facts and data and compassion, saying, here's what the data shows that you can do to fix this problem. Pretending the problem doesn't exist, screaming racism at numbers. This is all boring, and it's so fundamentally destructive to the black community that obfuscation of facts is the new plantation. So when Europeans illegally go to Africa and strip it of its resources, that's called evil colonialism. But when Africans go to Europe illegally and strip it of its resources, they're just migrants?